Tenant buyouts are one of the most commonly used lease termination tools that landlords, typically in rent-controlled areas, have to get rental units back. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what are the requirements specifically for buyouts, what are key things that landlords need to keep in mind when they're negotiating a buyout, and some helpful tips on negotiating buyouts. The first and foremost thing that landlords need to consider when doing buyouts, or to keep in mind when they're doing a buyout, is that the buyout is a completely voluntary agreement. The reason why buyouts are used and are popular is for rent-controlled areas. There's very few reasons in which landlords can get a unit back. Typically, there's certain provisions such as the tenant breaches the lease, they fail to pay rent, they create some sort of nuisance. The landlord wants to occupy the unit. There's a government order that's requiring the unit to be vacant, and a few other rules. Most of the time, landlords don't have any of that. The tenant is abiding by the lease, they're paying the rent, they're not creating a nuisance. The owner doesn't have themselves or family member that they intend to occupy the unit, and there's nothing that's requiring the unit to be vacant. So what ends up happening is when a landlord wants to be able to get possession of the unit back, typically to remodel the unit and release it for market rent, they engage in a voluntary buyout agreement, also known as cash for keys. Why they're extremely popular with landlords is because they cut through a lot of bureaucracy and red tape that's involved with evictions. If the landlord has grounds for an eviction, typically they don't. So evictions are very expensive. Trying to go that route is very expensive, very time consuming, aggravating, and landlord and tenants are immediately adversaries. The buyout, because it's voluntary, tends to be on the terms of the tenant and the landlord. There's a lot of flexibility. That being said, I'm going to go into my next point. There are rules. So there's many jurisdictions in Los Angeles, specifically where I do buyouts, that have specific rules and criteria. The rules come down to the amount of time that tenants have to reconsider and cancel the agreement, rules about filing the agreement, rules about the language the agreement must be in, rules about the minimum amount you can do buyouts in. Currently, Inglewood has minimums, but LA City, LA County have contemplated having buyout minimums. They don't currently have them right now, but they are contemplating that. And down to specific language that must be in the buyout and the font size. You definitely want to know what the rules are, or contact an attorney that's very familiar with the rules so that you make sure that your agreement is compliant. It's one thing I see a lot of, people, I don't see a lot of them, but I've heard of them. When clients want to do buyouts, they tend to hire me and I make sure that all the documentation is done correctly. Because what could happen is down the line, the tenant could try to avoid the agreement because certain procedures weren't followed, or it could make the agreement voidable. So you want to make sure that if you get a deal done with a tenant, that everything is documented correctly, it's filed with the jurisdiction, the rent control board or the city, if that's required. You don't want to give room for the agreement to later be challenged against you. The last thing I want to talk about is also kind of another point of why they're very popular is there's, again, flexibility in the terms. So the landlord and tenant, for the most part, can come up with the terms that they want to agree to. The amount for the buyout, unless it's subject to some sort of minimum, but landlord and tenant can agree on the buyout amount. They can, agree on maybe rent being waived as consideration for the agreement. They can agree on the move-out date. The move-out date could be, typically move-out dates are 30 days. Maybe it could be sooner. Maybe the landlord can agree to a longer move-out period, etc. So there's flexibility in that. If, let's say, the tenant owes money, there's flexibility in offsetting, a buyout amount or forgiving that rent in exchange for the tenant moving out. So there's a bunch of different negotiating tools that are at the disposal of pretty much both sides. But again, there's flexibility. So you and the tenant can come to an agreement that you and the tenant agree on. And so long as it complies with the handful of rules, typically about, cancellation periods, etc., the agreement will, go forward and be enforceable. And that's what I think it makes them so popular. There's a lot of negative things about tenant buyouts, but my key thing with them is that they are voluntary. That being said, landlords have to take into consideration that a tenant doesn't have to agree to a buyout. They don't have to agree to what you're offering. They don't have to agree to move. They don't have to agree to be bought out. But in the same breath, you, the landlord, don't have to agree necessarily to what the tenant wants. If the tenant wants, an amount of money that you simply do not have, or they want a longer period of time to move out that you are not willing to give them, then you also do not have to agree to it. But a thing I caution every landlord is that you want to be mindful of how you're talking, your approach with the tenant, because you don't want to teeter on being threatening or harassing to the tenant during the negotiation. So if you are a landlord looking to do buyouts of tenants, you can check out the other videos on my channel. I will link them at the end of the video. You can also go to my channel. There's a playlist about tenant buyouts. You can watch those, but it would be a good idea to talk to an attorney who's familiar with doing buyouts, to discuss with them the rules around it, what is required, what you want to do. But a lot of clients tend to do very well negotiating buyouts by themselves, but it's always very good to talk to an attorney, familiarize yourself. If you're in a rent controlled area and there's buyout requirements, you want to go check with that rent control board, check online to see if they have requirements, information, disclosures, FAQs. You want to get educated about the buyout process, what rights you as a landlord have, what rights the tenant has, so that you approach it with the most information at hand, and that your discussions with the tenant tend to be a little more fruitful when you have an understanding of the rules behind buyouts and the regulations, so that you can present the tenant with the correct information when you present them an offer or you discuss it with them. So that being said, I hope this video was helpful. If it was, I welcome you to sign up for my newsletter that I send every week. It has a lot of helpful information for landlords. I have plenty of free resources. You can check out my YouTube channel for other videos, my newsletter. I do some blogs, all of that designed to be very helpful for landlords. And thank you for checking out this video.